Why is it that when people talk about generational anxiety, you rarely join in? You're not outraged, not protesting, not explaining yourself. You just listen, and then you go back to whatever you were doing. Why is it that when policies shift, companies restructure, markets crash, and others react with shock or anger, you simply nod as if you already assumed things wouldn't stay stable forever? And why is it that in a culture that encourages express yourself, build your brand, be visible, you instinctively keep some distance? Not because you reject technology, not because you're behind the times, but because somewhere deep down, you've always believed that the safest position is not letting people know too much. If any of this feels familiar, then today isn't about nostalgia, and it's not about a generation gap. It's about a psychological structure shaped inside high uncertainty and low emotional cushioning. Why do you appear the most independent and yet the most silent? Why do you seem calm, but always prepared for what might go wrong? And what happens when someone learns, at 8 years old, to unlock the front door alone? Does that early independence make you stronger, or does it make it harder to ever fully relax? Picture this, 3:30 in the afternoon. The school bus stops at the corner. You step off, backpack over your shoulder, walk to your front door. The house is quiet. No one asks how your day went. No one reminds you to start homework. No one confirms you made it home safely. You unlock the door, find something to eat, turn on the television, and wait. This latchkey childhood wasn't rare. By the mid-1980s, millions of American children regularly returned to empty homes after school. This wasn't just independence, it was an environmental message. In developmental psychology, there's a concept often described as early internalization of responsibility. When a child is required to self-manage before they're fully ready, the brain absorbs a rule. No one automatically shows up. Over time, reliance stops being the default. You learn to solve first, process alone, handle things quietly. Later, people call this maturity. But at the time, it wasn't a personality choice. It was structural necessity. When independence isn't optional but expected, depending on others starts to feel like risk. And for many in Generation X, that was the psychological starting point. But the empty house was only the beginning. What shaped you even more was how rules worked. In many homes, consequences were immediate. You crossed a line. It was noticed. There was punishment, no long emotional processing, no extended conversations about how you felt. In psychological terms, this resembles what researchers call a high-contingency environment. Actions and outcomes were tightly linked. Little delay, little cushioning, little negotiation. When you grow up inside that structure, your brain adapts. You start predicting, calculating, running scenarios in advance. This is why so many in Generation X walk into meetings already carrying backup plans. Why contracts are read twice. Why worst-case scenarios are quietly considered before decisions are made. It isn't pessimism, it's conditioning. When you learn early on that mistakes carry real consequences, you don't test boundaries casually. Neuroscience suggests that environments with high consequence sensitivity strengthen forward-planning pathways in the prefrontal cortex. In simpler terms, you learn to think about outcomes before you act. Later, people call this rationality. But originally, it was a response to a world that didn't offer much margin for error. When you grow up in that kind of world, you don't treat optimism as a default setting. You hope things go well. But you don't bet everything on it. You work toward promotion, but you keep your resume updated. You invest in relationships, but you maintain emotional self-sufficiency. You're not cynical. You simply ask a question others don't always ask. If this falls apart, what's my next move? Psychology calls this defensive pessimism. It's a strategy where anticipating potential setbacks reduces the shock of losing control. For some people, it's a learned technique. For you, it feels instinctive, because stability was never guaranteed. You watched divorce rates climb. You watched companies downsize after promising loyalty. You watched rules shift mid-game. So trusting permanence felt risky. Instead, you learned to hope quietly and prepare practically. From the outside, you appear composed. From the inside, you're simply making sure the ground won't disappear beneath you without warning. This isn't pessimism, it's insulation, a way to remain steady in a world that proved it could change quickly. This structure also shaped how you relate to authority. You respect titles, but you trust competence. If a leader knows what they're doing, you'll follow. If they only hold a position without sound judgment, your distance is immediate. Because in your formative years, authority was not always dependable. You saw public scandals unfold. You watched institutions falter. You observed adults make consequential mistakes. Psychological research suggests that early exposure to inconsistent authority often produces a competence-based trust model. Trust is not automatically granted. It is tested. Performance precedes loyalty. This also explains why many in Generation X remain cautious about corporations, yet deeply invested in personal skill. You may not control whether layoffs happen, but you can control whether your contribution is difficult to replace. This isn't detachment, it's structural adaptation. You don't anchor security in institutions, you anchor it in capability. Because capability at least belongs to you. By now, a pattern may be visible. From the empty house to immediate consequences to anticipating instability before it arrives. This wasn't random, it was cumulative shaping. When independence was expected, when error carried weight, when permanence proved fragile. A certain temperament emerged, not dramatic, not loud, not easily unsettled. What others call silence is often measured restraint. What looks like distance is often calibrated caution. You don't rush to declare. You don't expose everything. You don't outsource your stability. Psychologically, this reflects high self-regulation and sustained environmental scanning. You aren't incapable of relying on others. You simply prefer to stand firmly first. Generation X occupies a rare historical position, old enough to remember a pre-digital world of privacy, young enough to adapt to a digital world of exposure. Bridges don't demand recognition, they support movement. They connect eras without centering themselves. And when silence is no longer defensive but intentional, independence stops being survival. It becomes composure. The ability to stay oriented in instability, to keep boundaries in noise. You don't rush to prove yourself, you don't rush to be seen, you know when to move forward and when to pause. And when someone can stand firmly even without being watched, that kind of strength often lasts longer than any declaration. This is Felix. May you understand yourself a little deeper and treat the growing version of you with patience and kindness. See you next time.